Hello, y'all. I prepared a short video with um, a summary of important information about the ideas and models of progress in Latin America, especially in the second half of the 1800s. Okay, so as we have discussed before in class, liberals led the struggles for independence in Spanish America and Brazil, but then what we observed is that conservatism was dominant in the aftermath of independence. But then, as history is like a cycle, and this is why it's so beautiful, in the mid 1800s, at about after 1850, what we have is a liberal comeback. And then this is highly influenced by a pursuit of progress. So we saw that conservatives had risen to power after the liberals who led the independence failed to deliver their promises. They had a view for Latin America, but the liberals, at that time, shortly after independence, they didn't have the financial resources to implement their vision, neither did they have the political support they would need. Also, the countries were destroyed by war, all the infrastructure was destroyed, so, and it was very difficult to implement the visions that the liberals had, because basically everything would have to be rebuilt from scratch. Then it's in this context that the conservatives rise to power again, and they promised security and tradition. Remember, the conservatives, uh, they valued Hispanic traditions like monarchy, Catholicism, and so on. And they highly relied on patronage networks. Remember that we talked about caudillos, the strong men that were perceived as um, brave, macho, because they came to prominence during the wars of independence, and they were famous for their prowess in the battlefield. They were also seen as generals because they would use sometimes their own personal funds, but also when they got to power, they would distribute the spoils of office to their followers. So, just a parenthesis in this idea of progress to explain how these patronage networks functioned. Let's suppose we have a fictional caudillo. Let's call him Dom Rafael. And then Don Rafael was upper class, owned lands, had his personal army, and once he got to power, he would distribute jobs in the government, pensions, and the likes to his followers that were called Rafaelistas, right? Just put istas after the name of the caudillo. So, for example, if we were talking about Don Manuel, then the followers would be Manuelistas. If we were talking about Don Miguel, then the followers would be Miguelistas, right? And these followers, they could be uh, people from different backgrounds, but mainly what we had was the people who worked for Don Rafael or Don Miguel or Don Manuel and their extended families. Okay, so for example, imagine Don Rafael had a godson, and then as he got to the office, he would give a job to his godson. And then, because of that, as a sign of like being grateful for the generosity of Don Rafael, then the the kid's mother would also support Don Rafael, and so would his father, his uncle, and so on. Um, but think about how people who were not part of the patronage systems reacted to that. They felt excluded and they looked for change. And this is when we start seeing a reaction, a liberal reaction. So what we had was that the Creoles, after independence, they kept all their investments were focused on lands, right? And they wanted to export. They wanted to have greater export possibilities to make more money. The urban middle classes, they were not benefited by these patronage systems that were mainly made by land-owning caudillos, and they demanded access to some public infrastructure and that public works be done in their towns. Another thing that influenced this liberal reaction was the Industrial Revolution, like the industrialization that was going on in Europe. If right after the independence, uh, England or France, they were not that interested in making loans to Latin America. Now they already had an accident of profit. They were willing to do investments, and also we are going to see that the technologies that came along with the industrialization of Europe also played an important role in the modernization of Latin America. Basically, what we had was a transportation revolution. So instead of the old boats that we had that would take months to cross the ocean to get from Europe to Latin America, now we had steamships that substituted these wood sailing ships. They had two important advantages. That is, they were much faster and they also carried much more cargo. So transportation was made much more efficient. And besides the steamship, we also had steam power trains. So the transportation that was done before through horses, mules, and carts now are done by train that also faster and carried more cargo. So what happened is that railroads, they were expensive, but they were valuable, and they opened access to new areas, creating an agricultural boom. Okay, but basically the railroad tracks, in many cases, they had a unlimited trajectory. They would go from producing the areas where the agricultural products were, where the crops were found, to ports. Okay, and besides these two technologies, the steamships and the steam-powered trains, we also had telegraph lines that made communication much more efficient. That is, they allowed for instant communication, and they also carried electricity, so they allowed for a lot of progress and development. In this map, we can see that there were telegraph lines that connected Europe to Brazil, in several parts of Brazil, and then other parts of Latin America. Basically, it was like this transatlantic telegraph lines. To conclude this part of progress, what we see is that the idea or the pursuit for progress becomes a hegemonic idea that was highly inspired by European models and European products, European culture, because basically for the land owning elites that were the most benefited by the agricultural boom, the export earnings could bring in European goods. There was a fixation in technology, and basically what we had was that the liberal bodies, the liberals themselves, they played a major role in this process of modernization, in this quest for progress in Latin America. So basically this was all for the idea of progress. I don't want to make the video longer, but that's it. Hope it helps.